there.
Oh,
There you go. So thank you all for joining Literally Alive during National Poetry Month. My name is Robert DiMonte, and tonight, poets Steve Langan and Gary Lawless discuss the ways their works in poetry and in community have led to access. Gary Lawless is co-owner of Gulf of Maine Books in Brunswick, Maine. Welcome, Gary. His most recent collection of poems, How the Stones Came to Venice, was published by Littoral Books, and in the fall will be published in Italy in Italian. The previous book, Caribudism, will soon be published in French translation. Welcome, Gary.
hi.
Floating up there in the North Pole.
We're getting a little flooding up here. The tundra is starting to melt.
Steve Langan is the author of the poetry collection Bedtime Stories, published by Littoral Books, part of the contemporary Maine poetry series. His previous collections are Freezing, Notes on Exile, and Other Poems, Meet Me at the Happy Bar, and What It Looks Like, How It Flies. Steve's background is in nonprofit public health administration, and he taught for many years at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where he served as Director of Medical Humanities. He founded Seven Doctors Project, a community writing project designed for mid-career physicians who were willing to claim job burnout and dissatisfaction in Omaha in 2008. And he partnered with the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance last year to bring it to Maine. Steve and his wife, Liz Ryan, an antiques dealer and estate seller, live in Yarmouth and on Cliff Island. Very nice. Steve, why don't you welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
Would you start us off with a poem?
I will. Good to be with you. It's the first reading from this beautiful book that Agnes and Jim of Littoral Books accepted and shepherded and had designed in a beautiful way, and included some great people, including the artist John Bisbee, whose work is represented there. Grateful to everyone who's involved. I'm going to read the title poem. It's called Bedtime Stories. There are 19 5-line unpunctuated stanzas, and it ends up in one of the places where I developed a lot of interest and curiosity and even obsession, and that's in a healthcare examination space where we've all been or will be. Takes a little while to get there. It's called Bedtime Stories. It's not that I don't like nature. It's just that it's everywhere. The ruins and sarcophagi, natives with machetes making minimum wage, truckers misspelling the names of states. I went out for a walk with Grandpa that didn't end. I fell in the lake again. By the fire, he warmed my clothes. He was a stern man, but kind to me. Believe me when I say I'm not going to make up anything. The day before wavered, and the day before that, we were fireflies in a bottle. When one of us was hungry, the others prayed more determinedly. When one of us was tired, another started to sing. It was nice to have such good friends, but giving up the faith still felt necessary. Standing alone one day, I realized what had occurred and how far we had come and how long it had been. I want to report back from what you called my special orbit, a long, overnourished missive about interdependence, a manifesto without the seriousness. If there's safety in numbers, count me in. I've gotten so old, I can hardly fantasize. You never think these things will happen. That car sure has a funny alignment. I'm just getting a tune-up, then I'll pick up the bread and milk. Oftentimes he sits amid the crowd at the park and on holiday, whistles as he looks in the windows of the trusty little boutiques. Yet a harsh feeling burns through this innocent scene. Remember resting my hand beneath her purple blouse. She was nippleless in the sunny afternoon. We were poor kids together before her father's company went public. And the almighty epigraph is dead. Dogma is nearly dead. The beautiful is alive and well. Let's refuse to retreat. Let's refuse to say no to beauty. Are you for or against beauty? Sure, beauty is overrated, but still we're talking about beauty here. In the butterfly's freedom represented by silence, I felt peace. Then she flew away. In sync, in purposeful rhythm, one of those days today, but as soon as the ease was acknowledged, it was the frenzy again descendant. Bags of birdseed from May 14 to June 20 are on sale. Hitched to a star your wagon, Justin. Unless I was drunk, I could never talk to that girl, Jasmine. In such plain spectral language, all I can survey is this billionaire of corn and wheat. Even the prices of the spices have gone up. A little candy for you and a little for me. Holiday traffic to contend with, damn it. We walked while we talked about the history of the town. To me, it's the dullest part of any journey. I've been trying to register the exclamations, feathers from all kinds of common birds, true and sure and willing to lead and be led. But as she moved clockwise, then counterclockwise, and we were all supposed to say seated, that was the longest 45 minutes of my life. Prayer in the morning. Try to do this every day. I'm just writing in my notebook, thinking of you. They say embrace reality, then they go away. An eternal conversation, 2 squad cars backed up, 2 cops talking to one another, windows unrolled, baby toys, lawn boys, trademark, happy times, sucking thumbs. This is the chain of command. Jim, Julie, Ed, Heidi, and Desiree. If Jim is out of the office, call Julie. Prayer in the morning. Do this every day. Passing the sleepers on the way to XYZ Gymnasium. In the dull origination, the pamphlets and manifestos secure in their little pouches, darling little neighbor girls in their ponchos. It really wasn't much of a challenge because that's how we do things around here. A story that ends even if we knew where to find it, even if we knew where to look. In examinations, in MRIs, one finds all sorts of things the patient thought might be there. Substantial blemishes, for instance, and little gravestones.
I'm gonna follow that up, I guess. Because Steve is up in Belfast right now, right? You're in Belfast?
In Belfast, Gary, your hometown.
My
Is
hometown.
the ghost of Gary Lawless around here in this
Yeah, well,
place?
in amongst the ghosts of several million chickens. That's so I'm gonna read a little poem from the book that Littoral published of mine, which is called How the Stones Came to Venice. And I was following the Stones to Venice because of my grandfather, in a way. My grandfather on my mother's side worked up at Mount Waldo in Prospect and Frankfurt in the granite quarries, and then later in his life moved to Belfast and pulled me into granite in a way. And then I went to Venice to see what the Stones were up to in Venice. But here's a poem that's called Driving Home from Belfast, and it's at the beginning of the book. So it's sort of, we're kind of talking about access, and this is the beginning of access to my little collection and to my delving into the voice of stone. So I hear the granite singing, and it is alive. I want to tell you that granite is a migratory species. Think plate tectonics, continental drift, glacial erratics. But you can read the flow lines from when granite was liquid and moving quickly. I want to tell you that lichen is a language of granite, that granite speaks with air and water and light. We might never know what stories it holds deep within the rock. So that poem sort of led me into this investigation, which is ongoing. I'm still investigating what stones have to tell us. And it's a very long story. They've been telling the story for a long time. Steve, have you been thinking about access?
I have been thinking about access, Gary. I appreciate your poem and I appreciate your book, which I've read over the last couple days, and the history and the movement and your keen observations and your time that you spent thinking about what poets think about, which is a single obsession. In your case, these stones and how they got to this place, and appreciate your work. When I think of access, Gary, well, I think it's among my favorite things, if not my favorite thing. It's probably a human universal. Being able to get behind the scenes on just about anything is an absolute thrill for me. And I think that my son is a representative of access in a very important and maybe more literal way than I've been as a writer. My son was fascinated from an early age about getting behind a fence into an abandoned building and exploring that abandoned building. Fortunately, he never got hurt, but he really has a fascination with zones that are forbidden. And I think I do too, as a thinker and a feeler and a writer and a maker of poems. And I think that's what the poem has helped do for me. It's brought me into the spaces where I've gained access, emotional access, mainly in my case, which is so important, and get to have experiences that are so much more vivid than my, paltry, simple ones. And I'm grateful for the art form, which helped save me in so many different ways. But back to a little bit of access, because your name came up, Gary, as I was browsing in the library here in Belfast. I saw Yankee Magazine, the most recent issue, places to live in New England, places that are on the cheap in New England. I thought this might be interesting. And I started leafing through that magazine, and there was a mention of you and your great bookstore, Gulf of Maine, and this idea that in that bookstore, you heavily stock banned books. Have you seen the magazine?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm interested in along this theme of access, what is your interest in banned books? I know they sell, but what is your personal interest in what might be considered something too hot to handle for some others? How does that, was that accurate in Yankee?
Well, they're primarily books that we already had. I mean, they're books that our customers are interested in reading in order to. I talked to a class at USM last week about. It was a class on ethics, and we were talking about the ethics of removing history and ideas and exposure. And I said that the reason this planet is so beautiful is because of the diversity of the planet. And the reason that humans are so wonderful is because of the diversity of humans. And yet there are people now who would try to deny the richness of diversity and even keep people from learning about things like that. So a lot of the books that are now seen as banned books are books that we would already have anyway, because they're important ideas. I mean, they're banning books about history because they don't want people to know that white people had slaves. We don't want to upset any white people. They're banning books about two male penguins raising a baby penguin together because that's unheard of. They just banned a book about a tree that can pollinate itself. So that, obviously a trans tree or something, we can't have that. So, the things that are being banned, um, are important, but have been read by people for many generations. I mean, what was being banned when we were in high school? Salinger was being banned. I mean, things, maybe Philip Roth or something. But it's important ideas in history that are being removed from the access of youth. God forbid youth should have their own ideas and form their own opinions and actually think. Because if they think, then they're going to vote in certain ways, and then that'll be trouble for the autocracy. Anyway, I think the banned books, it's sort of a label these days. For we already sold Mouse. I mean, there are all these books that are now banned. Um, in different places, and different places ban different books. So in some places it's African Americans history, in some places it's LGBTQ. I mean, there are all these different reasons. um anyway, yeah. And
But
we're a
it's
bookstore, we're supposed to.
essentially anti-access, yes?
Yeah, it's anti-access. That's right, that's a good way to put it. Thank you, Steve. Well, I was thinking in there's an interview with you at the back of the book, which all of you people watching should get Steve's book. But you have a quote now which I like a lot. It says, "Empathy is at the heart of literary and imaginative practice and doing." And I think, how do you where does that empathy come from? How do you get exposed? So do you want to talk about your literary practice in terms of empathy and access?
Sure. And when I talk about this, teachers who are more thoughtful than I, who teach creative writing, want to put a clamp to my mouth, because I have, for the most part, always waited for the writing to come to me, which means that there's a lot of waiting here in Belfast over the last few days, going into the next 10 days where I'll be here, and elsewhere. I like the idea of some phrase or line or idea just entering the way it does, and then of course going to work from there on that. And sometimes I've forced that, and but I think the writing of the poem feels to me a lot like what, and I've never been one, but I certainly admire them, what the method actors must do, what the, how they move into a character and get a feel for this language, and the humanness around it, and the humanity around it, and the many contradictions around it, and really getting a feel for what that lyric means, or where it's going, and what it needs to say, not necessarily what the poet himself needs to say, but what the lyric needs to say, or that monologue needs to say, or even that haiku needs to say. And really getting behind the idea that I like so much, it appeals to me so much, and I'm not sure who said it, that the poem is really what is unsaid. I think it might have been Samuel Beckett, but I could be wrong about that. Poem is what is unsaid. And that to me is kind of a pure, empathetic form of access, when somebody takes the risk of saying what they need to say, that necessary utterance, right? That necessary human, emotional, contradictory, it's not going to make everybody in the room happy utterance. Those are the poets, I think, who I'm drawn to. And maybe I channel a little bit of that myself, or at least try to, in my own poems. These contradiction and paradox in our emotional natures is so appealing to me, and the lyric poem often can sort that out for us.
Do you have an example? Do you have a poem that you would share as an example?
Well, I'm certainly not ready, but I'll leaf through the book, and I get to see names of some friends, including a longtime colleague, poet Elizabeth Powell. Welcome, Liz. Yeah. This poem is called The Band. From the beginning, I wrote them both, the words and the music, the rhymes and the chords. I spread the word and placed the advertisements and judged the auditions, then hired the band. I wish I could say the rest is history. I thought I could tell you something extraordinary. We practiced every day, had some laughs and fights, got some girls, opened once for Bon Jovi. I will never love nature as much as I should, or pets, or a coo of a baby, or sunset. I guess you could say we failed, the band. I accept the blame as I accepted the responsibility, and I offer you this one song, clearly our best, dated as it is, which they will sing to me, my children. Is that all there is in the end? Our work? In the bed, in the room, with the monitors. And despite that, and not even one glimpse of fame, I'm glad we tried to make it then and make it big.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my poetic access projects are really me trying to get access to communities from whom I would like to learn. First of all, I'd like to learn how to get along in those communities. You know, in the natural world, you sort of have to learn how to behave. If you're in a grizzly bear community, you have to learn how to behave when there are grizzlies around. But in amongst people in my state where I grew up, I've had to learn, you know, the social rules and the unspoken rules. And so over the last almost 50 years, I've been doing workshops with groups of adults with disabilities. I've been poet in residence at Preble Street, working with the unhoused people. I've worked with refugee populations. I've worked in the prisons. I've worked with combat vets. And I always say I go in using poetry as the vehicle for them. I tell them that everybody's story is worthwhile and everybody has an important story, and we learn to get along with each other because we listen to each other's stories with our hearts as well as our heads, and that gives us access to each other's contexts. So I wanted to share a poem of the longest group for over 45 years. I've worked with a group in Brunswick called Spindleworks. It's an arts center for adults with varying quote unquote disabilities. And a number of folks there, when I've been working there, don't read or write, but I do poetry with them because did Homer know how to read or write? You know, the poetry for hundreds of thousands of years was an oral art. So if you don't know how to read, and that was true at Preble Street at the homeless shelter too, there were people who didn't read or write. I didn't know about that. So I asked them to write me a poem about what that's like. So this is a poem I want to read. It's by Ellen Holt. It's called I Would Like to Learn to Read. I know one thing I can't do, read. It's hard for me when I can't read. What do I do if I get lost? I wouldn't know where I am. I wouldn't know what street I was on. That's what I want. I want to learn so I can read signs. If I could read, I would know what the signs say. I could read a newspaper, a book, read the Bible, read a cookbook, recipes in the cookbook. I could put the right things in the recipe. Tell what size my clothes are, what size shoes I wanted. Maybe if I wanted a teddy bear, I could find out how much it costs. Or if I wanted a record or a blouse, I could find out when the movies are. I could do all that if I could read. Now that's a pretty good piece of writing for someone who, quote unquote, can't read. And I think there are people among us who can't read, first of all because they have disabilities, but also because they're from Sudan, or you know, they come here from other cultures. They don't read English yet. They have great stories, and we don't know them yet. We haven't heard their stories. And in fact, if you look at world literature, up until about 10 years ago, we didn't honor many African writers, in part because translators don't get paid much to do that work, and also then they translate a book and it doesn't sell, so that's but my access in a way has been going around and encouraging groups to create poems and then listening to what they have to say and learning from that. And that gives me more questions to ask and more ways and things to encourage them to write and to tell me their stories. Now you said, well,
I don't
yeah,
want to steal your trade secrets, or maybe I
steal
do,
it,
Gary, but I'm
steal it.
very curious about how you uh, motivate them, how you gain their trust, how you situate yourself in that context. I'm a longtime teacher too, so I'm very curious about how you maybe you could tell us how you go into that space, because I'm sure
Well,
there's a fair amount of resistance.
there's a lot of, well, trust is really important. When I did the thing at Preble Street, I didn't just go and announce that we are going to have a writing workshop. I went for a few weeks and sat on the couch in the general room and talked to people and said what I did and told them what I did. And then finally one of them said, gee, we ought to have a group. And that way they owned it. It became their group. And because if that population is so fluid that I couldn't even suggest what we were going to do the next week, because most of them wouldn't be there the next week, so I just tried to be a resource and just encourage them. I told them I wasn't going to correct syntax and grammar because I didn't care. I wanted them to tell me their work without fear that I was going to judge it. And I, in part, I met some homeless veterans there who came to trust me, and eventually I went and did a workshop with combat veterans at the vet center in Lewiston. But those guys and women, there were some women in that group, they really had to trust me. They wouldn't say anything if they didn't trust me. It was different at Spindleworks. At Spindleworks, we tried to make it fun, but we would, some weeks we'd write about things that were really funny, and other weeks we'd write about things that were really serious. And we wanted people to be able to, we wanted to have poems from individual poets there so people could see them as individuals and not just a group of adults with disabilities. Well, Christ, we're all adults with disabilities. So when we sold one of their weavings, you could get a little chapbook of their poems as well, and then you would learn who they were. But it wasn't fast. I didn't just go in and say, I'm here and I'm a teacher and I'm going to teach you how to write a sestina. They didn't want to know that. But it was a whole different thing. It wasn't an academic pursuit. It was more a heart pursuit where I was trying to make people feel what they had to say was important. It counted. But I didn't care. I mean, they didn't have to say this poems. They could be good car mechanics or cooks or fashion designers or musicians, or there were all these different ways. I just wanted them to feel that what they had to express was important and worthwhile. And when you're on the street as a unhoused person, you don't feel that way, And a lot of once I asked I asked the whole group of the disability workshop to write about how it felt to be called a retard, because I really wanted to do workshops to get rid of that word. And we were going to high schools and try to get rid of it. And Rita Langley wrote this really short poem that was handicap. I heard about it, but I ain't got it now. That was Rita's response, and that's a pretty damn good one. We've used that for like 30 years in a lot of writing about the workshop and what it does. And so you've done work with doctors, with people who are literally healing, not just healing with words, but literally healing with the practice in their life. So how does that work for you? How does that combination?
Well, in 2008, I put a call to action out at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and asked people to spread the word, seeking mid-career physicians who are willing to claim job burnout and dissatisfaction. We weren't talking about that much in America in 2008. We're talking about it a lot now. But back, I was really surprised. I figured I'd just go home. But 7 of these mid-career doctors, average age 54, signed up for the workshop. I recruited 6 writers to join me. It was in some ways one-on-one in that classroom. I've always had a fear and a hesitation about physicians and healthcare, not unlike my grandfather, but for a different reason. I'm a long-time recovering alcoholic and addict. You know, the good health, as the writer Dennis Johnson says, depends on the ability to fool doctors, right? And so I still had this in my system. So I was very insistent, Gary, with the writers who joined us, that we're not here to flatter them. We're going to make it difficult. They're on our turf now. And they thought I was a bit of a madman, and they were probably correct. But we developed a kind of rigor around our approach that I think really benefited them. So our first session was 9 weeks long, every Thursday, 5:30 to 7:15 p.m. And a few weeks into that session in the spring, it was the most beautiful day in the history of Omaha, Nebraska, and all 7 of them were there. And that meant so much, that we were offering them something different and special. Not that we're that special, but the offering is special. And here's why I think it is: because they have jobs that are routinized for the most part. Same kidney, same kidney, same kidney. And we were giving them, back to that word access, some ping, some delivery to the imagination. And it really started to affect these individuals. There's a lot of literature on this. There's a lot of data on this, but we got to see it in real time. We got to see people practicing making art, in their case, starting a poem, a piece of creative nonfiction, and a piece of fiction, and having it workshopped and having a mentor and going through this many weeks together. We got to see these individuals start to really change. I mean, visually change. And then we would hear things like, I don't know what you're doing with my husband over there in that workshop, but it just seems like he's more energized and relaxed at home. We'd hear from colleagues, and we kept doing this 17 sessions with various healthcare workers and community members, and always a lot of physicians in our groups. And it caught on. And it's probably the most important work that I've done personally, because my fear and my hesitation and my wariness turned into compassion and interest and empathy and sympathy. And I'm just so grateful for it, because I got to tag along with these people at work and shadow them and learn about them and interview them. And they trusted us too. They trusted the writers back with their sort of valuable personal information. There's a lot of sharing. And at the end of each session, we would have public readings that were well attended. And these individuals would not be afraid at all of talking about that kidney in a room of 2,000 people in, Paris. But to read a 4-minute original composition on a stage gave them terror. But at the conclusion of that terror-making experience, there was a real celebration. I made an original composition. I shared it with other humans in a room. And it's something that we're continuing to do with Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, and nice session recently. But one of the things I would talk about, Gary, and this might be a little bit provocative, and you tell me if it is, I can handle it. I would suggest, when I was talking about 7 Doctors Project at various schools and places and conferences and stuff, I would say that the physician cohort is an underserved one. And then I get ready to have somebody throw something at me. But what I mean by this is, who is there to serve that group? And one of the frequent comments that we received as writers and teachers of these mid-career docs who are claiming burnout is, until I found this writing experience, I was ready to end my career. I was ready to, they said it, end my life. Not everyone, of course, but some. I was so out of sorts. And the writing experience helped in some ways reassemble these human beings. And that's the power of what the poem, the story, the essay, and the guidance that we give really is. And just just so grateful for that experience and what I learned from them. And the number one theme, and I'll pass it back to you, Gary, the number one theme of that research was the fear of their making a mistake over and over. I'm terrified of making a mistake, which helped in the recruitment, which was coming over and makes lots of mistakes with us. Sometimes the mistakes in literature are the best part.
Well, I'll say I like the word reassemble. I think that especially when I was working with the unhoused population at Preble Street, they were literally trying to reassemble a life. A number of them have been turned out of Pineland, or they had been turned out by court orders that closed the institutions that were housing them and put out on the street, and a lot of them didn't have a safety net, and they hadn't had a life outside of the institution. They were trying to reassemble something that made sense, but no one was making sure they ate. No one was making sure they took their meds. No, I mean, there was this whole like drop. They were just dropped onto the street. And I had no idea what that life was like. So I couldn't correct anything they said, because in that group, or in the group with the veterans especially, if I said, I understand what you're saying, they would know I was lying, because I didn't have that experience. And I was trying to get them to give me a little access of what that experience was like. It wasn't like I was trying to write a poem about it either. I was trying to encourage them. And so this is a Portland poem for those of you. I got this in Portland at Preble Street with a guy named Mike Hicks, who was wonderful. Was having mental difficulties at the time, wasn't taking his meds necessarily. And I asked them to tell me what it was like to be them. So this is Mike's poem. It's called Billy. When Billy turned 5 and started school, the teacher asked, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And these are the things that Billy didn't say. I want to be a junkie and a dope addict. I want to get married too young and beat my children and my wife. I want to sell my body to perverts in the park for $20 or crack cocaine. I want to live on welfare, food stamps, and be a burden to my fellow man. I want to beg for quarters so I can buy some beer. I want to sleep under bridges and have young punks call me a bum. I want to stay in shelters and slowly go insane. I want to drink cheap wine and puke and piss in my pants. I want to eat in dumpsters and soup kitchens and smoke cigarettes that I find. I want to be called lazy and be shunned by so-called gentlemen. I want to smell of unwashed skin and grow to hate my fellow man. I want someone to kill me for the things that I've become. I want to be called loser, a vagrant, and a bum. The things that Billy did say are irrelevant because he's dead, killed by the heroes of the town. Mike Hicks. Mike later, one day was off his meds during a snowstorm, and he walked into a convenience store carrying a samurai sword, and he was naked. And so the clerks called the police. Mike was arrested, and it made the 6 o'clock news, and they were all laughing. Oh, naked guy with a sword in the store. This is funny. So I faxed 5 of Mike's poems, including that one, to all the news stations and said, "This is the guy that you're making fun of, and maybe you should talk about safety nets and mental health before you laugh." And they all read those poems, and they did on-air apologies.
Wow.
It
Wow.
it worked, and they saw him as a human being, I saw that happen, and now he's good. He's out in Oregon living on a farm, and he's fine. He's having a good life, but he hit a rough patch, and I didn't really understand what that life was like. I still don't really understand what that life is like, but through those folks, they were willing to share it with me through poetry. And in a lot of those groups, they felt more comfortable writing about their lives in poems than they did talking to their counselors or talking to peer groups. They felt somehow more comfortable that they could do it as a poem. And that was it was powerful to me to see that form was a place, like you were saying with the doctors, it allowed them to be something else than the shield that they had put up around themselves. And they could really talk as people because they thought maybe you were listening, maybe other people were listening to them as people, as seeing them as who they were. And I mean, I read a lot of poetry to see who is this? And I just want to ask you a question. You know, I lived in California, outside of San Francisco with a bunch of poets, okay? Gary Snyder. I lived at Gary Snyder's house. And one of our great heroes was Robert Duncan. And on page 32 of your book, although you don't say who said it, you say, often I am permitted to return to a meadow.
Yeah, I love that poem.
Makes sense now. And Thoreau and Emerson. So Robert Duncan and Thoreau and Emerson are making sense now. Right? I mean, you're getting a little bit of Duncan, but what is it that's making sense to you now? Emerson, Thoreau.
I'm playful a lot in my poems, and the idea that I'm making, and I hate to talk about them too much, but I will for you, Gary. The idea that I'm making a claim like that is sort of my way of putting, like, I'm all grown up now. All those young man things that I said, all that crazy shit that I did, all those weird things that I thought, all the madness that I was enveloped in, I'm done with that. Emerson makes sense now, and Thoreau, and that beautiful poem by Robert Duncan, often I'm permitted to return to a meadow. Oh, isn't that a beauty? Thanks for catching that. That's really nice. And that makes me feel really great.
It's
Such a good reader. But
we heard him. He read at Orono. He read at the University of Maine at Orono, and Beth and I went to hear him, and it was just a wonderful experience.
Oh, we'll have to talk about that more. I want to read.
Steve, can you read that poem? Sorry, it's Robert interjecting here. Could you read the poem that you're reading?
It's a really long. I'm glad you said that, Robert. It's a really long one that I'm going to read for Agnes on May 1st at 7 p.m. at Batco Books. But I would love to read this.
Read the sixth line. Yeah, read the sixth line part too. But no, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Read what you were going to read. 245.
245. Okay.
It's
6 lines. It's 6 lines from a quite a long poem that takes place over 3 days, but it goes like this. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow makes sense now. And Thoreau and Emerson, here I am feeling a sense of wonder. Then there I go, developing categories of wonder. For the first time in my life, I feel this mad curiosity, and I do not want to die or care that I will.
I love that mad curiosity. Yeah.
I'd love to read you this poem that your stories reminded me of, and I think one of the reasons for this poem, or the things that made me excited to have written it, is I wanted to, just like a painter plays with paint a little bit. I did from the we perspective. I don't know if it works or not, but it was fun to play with. It's called A Box of Ornaments. We placed the box of ornaments in the corner out of the way, and we started to heap the other boxes on top of the box of ornaments. I understand this is common in the suburbs. One day we caught a disease. It was fatal. Reluctantly, we attended the support group. It is where we learned to say we with little irony. We are going to die, for instance, we said, and let's meet later at Red Lobster, which we learned to say, Red Lobster, thinking of the weight of the enormous plastic menu. with no detectable irony. Sustenance is our evolution and an affront, one of us blurted out, and no one at Red Lobster judged him for it. We had our own booth. Generally, only 4 could sit comfortably, but we were pretty thin. We turned different shades, including gray and yellow. Most of us had terrific memories, even for details. We could hardly believe how expendable we were. No one said this directly. We were emotional only so much as the situation allowed. The waitress is beautiful, for instance, and the waitress's child has leukemia. Describing our symptoms was poetic, symphonic. Some of us were in remission, and others, well, their refusal to update us on their condition became a sore subject. We had to ask their spouses and lovers and older sisters on the sly, and sometimes even they couldn't tell us, which we marked as a kind of bravery, for which we all shared obvious envy.
I'm wondering, Robert, how much time do we have? Is there time? Do people have questions or comments? Is Robert there?
I'm here. You just did my job.
Well, no, I'm just wondering about time. That's all.
We have 10 minutes and there's plenty of time for questions. I have a question or a comment I'm going to cede the audience. So Gary and Steve, we've had several shows where I guess the topic of the poet's role in society has come up. And I'm just seeing some like sort of dovetail going on here. Not so much with the poet's role, the whole idea of access, the poet's role, what the poet can do in culture and society. Is there any commentary from the audience, from people who have been in on that conversation, who might want to make a comment, or do you have anything to say about? It might be a very broad question for this night, but what is the role of the poet in society?
That's a broad question.
Anybody from the audience want to chime in on that one? We'll pass on that then, I guess.
I'll talk about that.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things we do as experienced makers is we get to take seriously other makers. I mean, when you've written as much as Gary has, I've written a little myself, others who are on the screen who are experienced makers, that is really, really important time spent. And in the work of others, we get to see things because of our experience that they're just starting to see and help speed their progress toward their goal, which is always the same one if people are honest. They want to write the greatest poem they can. They want to write the greatest poem that's been written in the state of Maine today. They want to write the greatest poem that's ever been written. I mean, let's face it, these are the mad goals of artists and makers. And while none of that might occur, along the way, they get access to pretty deep reservoirs of feeling. They get to sort things out, as we've been talking about. Like William Faulkner would talk about the human heart in conflict with itself. That's everybody. And they get to sort out and sort through and move through and test and probe and even write their way against these deep, complicated human situations. And to me, the experience of making, the time that I've been doing it and giving away that making to others in a classroom setting or one-on-one or whatever, that's the best. That's like a pure contribution. And there are lots of ways to, make mistakes around that too. But man, it can be a deep bond. I think that's the role of the poet.
That was a beautiful response. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to read a couple of comments, if you don't mind. Monica Wood has been steadily commenting, as well as Carl and Kate. Most recently, Monica has said, I am not a poet, but poems offer me aid and comfort so many times. Thank you for that, Monica. And Carl shared a link to the Duncan poem. And Kate Kearns said, holy shit, to something that you said further back. So Kate, thank you for that wonderful commentary. If you'd like to expand on that, you're welcome to.
I want to say that if anyone has read Monica's books, they know that she is a poet. She just puts her poems in paragraphs. This woman is a wonderful writer. Her plays, her fiction, her nonfiction, Monica, and she's got a new book coming out, which may be called How to Write a Novel. It's called something similar to that, which I don't think is actually a guidebook, but she might answer that. That's a book plug, But buy Steve's book first.
Yeah, as usual, we are coming up on the end. We do have some time for questions if anybody'd like to chime in. Kate has said it was a response to Mike's poem. So there you have that. Not sure what that meant. And let's see. I think that's it for comments. Anybody have a question? I'd love to hear another poem from one of you, frankly. Gary, if you'd like to share one for the way out, or maybe each one of you can share a poem.
Sure. I'll yeah, I'm dealing with gender issues right now because my poems are being translated into Romance languages where nouns are all gendered, and apparently I've given the wrong gender to several nouns. I was looking at an iceberg and calling the iceberg she, and my French translator said, "Oh no, icebergs are le. You can't do that." I'm going to read a poem. I'm the literary executor and great fan and publisher of Nanao Sakaki, the wandering Japanese poet. And I want to read the poem that gave me access to his work and led me for years into Nanao's work. This is a poem by Nanao Sakaki from 1966. A good philosophy. If you have time to chatter, read books. If you have time to read, walk into mountain, desert, ocean. If you have time to walk, sing songs and dance. If you have time to dance, sit quietly, you happy, lucky idiot.
Could you say the last lines of that again, Gary?
If you have time to dance, sit quietly, you happy, lucky idiot.
It's pretty great.
All right, I'm going to end with a poem that also has the word idiot in it. I just have to find it. It's called After Trying Everything I Could Think of to Amuse Myself. After trying everything I could think of to amuse myself, the mind is. There is nothing but the mind. If I don't have the mind, I don't have the mind. You don't mind if I don't have the mind sometimes. If I don't have the mind today, Maybe you have the mind today. I don't want to be like you. I don't want that kind of mind. I am honoring them. I know they hurt you. Even though we honor the ones who hurt you, we do so to share a story about honor and dishonor with the children. I'm a gentleman most days. See, I walk you to your car. I open the door, say hello to your mother, wife, sister, cousin for me. I've always wanted to go up and kiss that painting by Andrew Wyeth. Yeah, the one Janet hates. It reminds me of who I was in 1984, carefree. 2 weeks after his graduation, grandfather was on a boat off Japan. I brought home this sword. It goes to your brother. And this little trinket reminded me of your sister. Now that I have your attention, here's how we organize the will. You are all in it. You are all in it. And for the last time, no drunken driving. These are our cars, not yours, you idiots.
So we're ending the event with idiots. Yeah. The humility of it all.
Terry. I didn't know.
It's Belfast. It's
I
Belfast.
knew we'd get there. I just didn't know how. Which is the highest compliment you could give to somebody, right? Call him an idiot. That's like friendship, man.
Yeah. Well, I asked him now what he meant by that, and he said, "You don't pretend that you know everything, and you always think there's more to learn." I love it. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man. I
There's
wasn't so
always more to
sure.
learn.
I wasn't so sure around 7:20 p.m. where we were going, but we got there.
We got somewhere.
Well, we have
Now,
some great comments. If you don't mind, Elizabeth Powell said, "Love your new book so much, Steve. Great poem."
Thanks for
Claire
the blurb,
Milliken,
Liz Powell.
right on. Hooray for idiots, Claire. Carl Little, Idiot Wind. And a big heart from Susan Cook.
well, are you going to tell us where we can hear Steve next?
I'll let Steve tell that story.
I will be reading poems with Mike Bove, who is also releasing a new book at Back Cove Books on Forest Avenue on May Day at 7 p.m. We'll also have a reading coming up at the end of May, on May 30th, working on the details. I'll be working alongside sculptor and now 2D artist and musician whose work is included on the cover of this book. Professor John Bisbee and I will be in conversation in Brunswick at the studio at the Mill on May 30th. Oh, Agnes just reminded me it's at 6 p.m. on May 1st. Thank you very much, Agnes.
And that's 6 p.m. May 1st at Back Cove Books in Portland on Forest Avenue, correct. Right on. And the mill in Brunswick, is that the Fort Andros?
Details to be determined.
Gotcha.
It is Fort Andros. It is Fort Andros, yeah.
All right.
14 Main Street, Fort Andros.
That's terrific. You guys, such a great show tonight. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your words. And I really enjoyed tonight's program, as I'm sure our audience did. And I just want to remind everybody that we'll do another Littorally Alive next month. We always do them on Wednesday nights. Most of the time we do them on Wednesday nights. I believe the next one coming up may be on a Tuesday night. Stay tuned and check the website. And if there's any parting words from either one of our readers, say it now, and I will end the recording. And this will be added to the website, the Littoral Books website, on the Littorally Alive page within a week or two.
I would say support your local independent publisher because they're doing such good work.
I would agree with that.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
That was great.